welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very powerful show coming right up with special guest Elizabeth-Partridge, and she's here today to share with us her new book, Boots on the Ground, America's War in Vietnam. Now, Elizabeth graduated with a degree in Women's Studies from the University of California at Berkeley and later studied traditional Chinese medicine. She was an acupuncturist for more than 20 years before closing her medical practice to write full-time. So let's welcome to the show, Elizabeth.
Thanks for having me.
What a pleasure it is to have you here. And as a child that was born in the 60s, I was so delighted to see your book.
It was quite an interesting time.
Yeah, I don't remember a whole lot of it, but I know through textbooks just and reading the different things that happened. Of course, I had family members that were in Vietnam. I've got to ask you, what inspired you to write this book?
You know, it was one of those things that kind of came up in pieces. I was a protester in the late 60s and early 70s. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, which was a hotbed of both protesters, and of course we had induction centers here, and we had shipping that was going out of the Bay Area to Vietnam. And I just really, this was the first televised war, as it's called, and I just was very upset by what I saw. I just hated the suffering. I hated the deaths. I just hated the whole thing. It just felt horrible to me. Now, what was interesting is protesters and veterans really didn't mix. So I could see who in my school was going to end up going to the military because it was a big urban school. And it wasn't the kids like me who were headed for college. It was kids who didn't have a way to get out of the draft, because going to college was one of the ways you could get out of the draft. So it was kind of unfair who went into the draft. But over the years that followed, I rarely talked to anybody about their experiences in Vietnam, because the men and women who came home generally kept their heads down, tried to get on with their lives. So I did hear one or two stories that were heartbreaking to me, but I just was going along with my life. And then in 2011, I went to visit the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and I was feeling it's an overwhelming and beautiful experience. And I was touching the granite and the names etched into the granite, and I started crying. And I thought, why am I crying? I don't know any of these men and women. And I was like, wow, how could I honor these people? That's what I wanted to know. How could I, as a writer, honor the people who lost their lives in Vietnam? And the way I figured out to do it was to do interviews of the men and women who were there, who knew the people on the memorial, and who could tell me about their lives, their story, their friends that they lost. So that's how I ended up with writing a book about the Vietnam Veterans War.
I love how you have this, and it's for young adults and up, so it's really a book that's good for pretty much all ages. And you have a lot of photos in here so people can make that emotional connection with really what's going on and really get to see what it was like.
Yeah, the photos are a really important part. So I interviewed the I think 7 veterans and was able to hear their stories, but then I wanted to pair it with the impact of actually, the same thing that had impacted me, seeing footage on television, reading magazine articles. I wanted that impact for young adults today, or adults. This is one of those books they call a crossover. We write them for teenagers, but they actually cross over into adults who are interested in the subject. So I just wanted to be able, that silly trait expression, picture's worth 1,000 words. It is so true in this case because there's so much information you can learn and so much emotional impact in the photos I was able to find for this book.
Well, and you mentioned that this book really had a profound impact on you growing up, and I could imagine during that era, I was a little bit too young, but like during that era, that there was so much that was happening, and everything seemed almost so visceral. What were some of the things that you found yourself, and I know you talked about a few of them already, but some of the things you found that really, changed your life in some way because of that?
I think this is something I learned kind of in retrospect. I learned that there's all kinds of patriotism. There's like the patriotism of saying to your country, you're asking me to do this, I will do my job, and I will do it the best that I can. And it's also patriotic to protest what your government's doing. That this is democracy. This is how we roll in a democracy, is that we work this stuff out. Everybody gets a chance to express their opinion. That's not true if you're not in a democracy. Maybe in a country where you cannot go against the leaders of your country. So I was able to participate in that, and I still have really strong feelings, that, this is our country. We have to fight for it to be what we want it to be, each of us. And, there's one small piece of that is voting. A very, very critical part of it is voting. But then it's all kinds of other ways that we belong to our democracy.
What a beautiful way to answer that. I appreciate you being so open in regards to that, because it's really interesting. I think the Vietnam War really affected a lot of people in a lot of different ways. And so to, look at it and then also be able to write a book that I think gives a very honest view of that time, I felt it was very profound.
Thank you.
Well, you're welcome. My goodness. And one of the things I was surprised at, I didn't know, is, how President Johnson, he had a way of intimidating people, and you have a picture in your book that illustrates that so well.
Yeah, I know. I love that picture. This is a picture where he's talking to another man, and he's leaning forward. And the poor guy he's talking to, first of all, Johnson was physically intimidating. He was 6'2" and a big, bulky guy. But he's leaning straight into this guy. The poor guy has got one foot back in order to keep his balance. And around the corner, peeking through the door, are two of Johnson's assistants laughing because this was called the Johnson treatment. And he would bully his way to get people to do what he wanted. I loved working on the Johnson chapters because President Johnson took us deeper and deeper into the war. And yet he was very conflicted about it. And I hadn't realized that as a young person. What I saw were the broadcasts that he gave about how things were going and we were going to win this war, but he was going to send some more young men over. And I didn't know the backstory. So now, many years later, I can listen, I was able to listen to a lot of tapes that were recorded and people's memoirs where they talked about being in the Oval Office. And I was able to see just how terribly conflicted he was and that this was heartbreaking for him as well as for the whole country.
You can see that. You have another photo of him where it's like he's breaking down listening to a tape from his son-in-law.
Yeah, his son-in-law was there and was sending back these reel-to-reel tapes, which were at the time the best way of actually hearing somebody's voice and hearing what their story was. And Johnson is literally has his head down on the table. I mean, he's just, he's listening to his son-in-law, Charles Robbs, just tell him about how he's lost a bunch of men. And, Johnson did feel acutely the cost of what he was doing. And yet he couldn't, for various reasons, these guys just kept taking us deeper and deeper in. I think by the end of 1967, President Johnson had nearly 500,000 men and women serving in Vietnam. That's so many. That's very, very many. Vietnam is an extremely small country. We're a big country, and we had a lot of people there in harm's way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was just a really interesting time. And, I know that Johnson was a real kind of like just how conflicted you were sharing with us, how conflicted he was kind of surprising. Was there anything else that really surprised you when you were doing your research for this book?
Once you have the advantage of time, decades passing, mm-hmm. you can really, you look at something differently than you would look at it in the present time. So I had that advantage of looking at all the presidents who were you can start looking at our involvement in Vietnam from the time that we helped the French, and which was after World War II, the French who had colonized Vietnam before the war, but then Japan got in control of Vietnam during World War II, and then it went back to the French taking over again, thanks largely to our support. But then the first president who really deeply took us in was President Kennedy. But then it goes all the way through to President Ford. So, we had a number of presidents who were struggling but not able to see their way out. So that was one of the things that surprised me, was just watching these, what seems in hindsight like terrible mistakes. Mm-hmm. I think I also, because my absolute favorite part of working on this book was interviewing the men and women who were involved in the whole conflict, I didn't truly understand how deeply they faced certain moral issues. When you're raised, anybody in any culture is raised, thou shalt not kill. That is like a basic tenet of all of our upbringing. Then you take somebody and you put them in the military, a young man, and you say, your job now is to kill. That is a huge shift that they have to make. And so for each of the men that I interviewed who became boots on the ground, how did they make that shift? And then what I found even more painful, how did they, as civilians, make that shift back? That is, to compromise your moral integrity so profoundly like that is just, it's unfathomable. It's unfathomable to me as a mm-hmm. person who's never had to go through that. And to hear their struggles, it was really interesting and really touching to me to listen to them talk about how they became who they were in the military. For example, I had this one lovely guy, Chief Allen, because he was eventually a fire chief. He was actually trained by Martin Luther King to be a nonviolent protester. He was in Selma, Alabama during the March for the Vote in 1965. So literally he's trained in nonviolence. He ended up a machine gunner in Vietnam a few years later. So he had to go from nonviolent training all the way over to being, as he said, I was a trained killer. That's what I was trained to be. And so then he got, what do you call a mean spirit? I got a real mean spirit. I wanted revenge. So here he is in Vietnam with a machine gun. And then one day he is asked to guard a pile of dead bodies of North Vietnamese soldiers in Viet Cong. And other people are going through their pockets looking for papers that might be of interest to the military to learn something. And he's seeing pictures of family, of girlfriends, of children. And he suddenly realized, oh, they're people. I'm a person. They're a person. I'm doing my job. They're doing their job. He said that was the moment he realized how profoundly he had lost his humanity, and he had to begin struggling to get it back. Now, for him, he has a very deep and profound respect for and love of God. And so when he came back and tried to get back to his civilian self, he was able, through a very close relationship to God, to make that transition. But of course, not everybody has that. So other people had to find ways to make it back. And it was tough. It was very, very, very tough. Also, I interviewed one man who was a medic who saw just, he was caught in a lot of firefights. He had a lot of decisions he had to make about who would live, who would die, who would be rescued, who wouldn't be rescued. And, he went through a period where he lost so much faith in who he was and who he hadn't been able to save that he almost committed suicide. He would put a gun to his head repeatedly every night, and then he'd be like, look, I've gone through too much to end my life at this point. So I just, I had to think about this, like, when is violence so profound in your life that you turn it against yourself? When does that eventually come all the way around for you? Now, he saw so many difficult situations. He's in his 70s now, and what he told me now is, he said to me, if you want to wake me up, do not touch me. Stand by my feet and start talking, but never touch me. I just thought, wow, he's still so able to go back to, he's wired now for going back to that time, and he will spend and has spent his whole life in that place.
It's interesting from the family members I have that were in Vietnam, a couple of them, they came back, and the PTSD was so tough that they really weren't able to get beyond that, and it was heartbreaking. And there wasn't really any help for that too, So you look at just how we expected so much of these young men. They were drafted, they didn't have a choice, and then they come back, and we really don't have support for them to help them work through that transition.
Yeah, that's something I found very upsetting. They did not receive any help. As Chief Allen said to me, nobody could help you. Your friends couldn't help you, your family couldn't help you, and there was no help from the military. These guys were literally flown back to the United States, given if their 2-year service was up, they were given a handshake and told, you are now a civilian. And then they were just had to get an airplane and get home, or get a train and get home. And they just went from one situation to another with no help. And, we know it's very, very difficult to help with PTSD. It's requires a tremendous amount of support. And even then, some of it will never go away for a lot of people. But the fact they got no help is really upsetting. And there's, that we're still very limited and underfunded in how we help our veterans today. And I also also find really heartbreaking. We have a higher suicide rate among veterans than we do for non-veterans. And I was really interested in that. And I was just like, how can it be that we're still in a place where, we ask our military to defend us, and yet we don't support them personally. And that bothered me so much. And I heard there was a veterans suicide hotline, a veterans crisis line, as they call it, that there was a phone number you could call. But then I heard someone who was high up in the VA talking about how they were not answering 1/3 of those phone calls. And it made me so angry. And then I heard that they had, put a lot of resources on it, and they had changed it. So I wanted to put the phone number for the Veterans Crisis Line in my book, but I didn't want it to be part of the way a veteran might think they could get support but wouldn't. So I called the Veterans Crisis Line, and I talked to a young woman there, and I said, I just want to make sure that everything is working with you guys because of this book that I'm writing. And she's like, oh, you're writing a book? I'm like, yeah, I'm writing a book. She said, do you have any suicidal thoughts? I was like, no, really, I am writing a book about this. I'm not a veteran. But she just really
went through the checklist with you, right?
She did. And you know what? I really appreciate it. At the very end of the conversation, she said to me, well, thank you for calling. And I'm going to tear up when I say this, and she said to me, I'm so glad to know that you are safe right now. And that won me over because I thought, if I was lying to her, she just did this wonderful job of making me feel somebody cares that I put down that gun and did not commit suicide. So I did put their number in the book, and may I say it here while I'm talking with you?
Oh, please do. Please do. I'd love for you to share that number.
Thank you. So the Veterans Crisis Line is 1-800-273-TALK, which is 1-800-273-8255. You can also find it easily online, and they do staff it 24 hours a day now.
On that note, we're going to pause here for a quick break. We've been speaking with Elizabeth-Partridge on her new book, Boots on the Ground, America's War in Vietnam. We'll be right back after these messages.
Internationally recognized and award-winning author Judy Goodman works and teaches outside the box of limited thinking. Working with people from every walk of life, her goal is to empower you to be the best you can be, no matter what the challenge is. Born with the gift of seeing beyond our normal vision, she has an extraordinary gift of working with every challenge. Teaching beyond conventional wisdom, her work is described as life-changing. Visit judygoodman.com. That's judygoodman.com.
There comes a moment when you realize you're somewhere special, when you discover that each beautiful creature that you see has been rescued from a life of absolute horror and brought to this incredibly free place. Here's where their lives were forever changed and where yours will as well. Discover over 500 tigers, bears, and lions at the brand new visitor center at the Wild Animal Sanctuary just outside Denver. For more information, visit wildanimalsanctuary.org. Discover true freedom at the Wild Animal Sanctuary.
Have you ever had the sense that your thoughts might actually be doing something? Ancient secrets of manifesting have been masterfully revealed in the award-winning book Manifesting 1-2-3 by Ken Elliott. For the first time, the author's experiences and stories in this book describe exactly how your thoughts can create anything. You've been doing this all your life, but it's never been fully explained for you until now. Visit manifesting123.com for more information today. Manifesting123.com.
There are nearly 2 million Americans living with amputation. Many live right here in San Antonio. Becoming an amputee can be scary, frustrating, isolating, but there's no reason to feel alone. The San Antonio Amputee Foundation is here to help support you and guide you toward resources such as home and car modifications and even prosthetic limbs. For more information or to make a donation, visit saamputee.org. We'll help you live a full, active life, one step at a time. San Antonio Amputee Foundation, healing limbs, hearts, and souls.
Welcome back to Moments with Marianne. We're here today with special guest Elizabeth-Partridge, who's here to share with us her book, Boots on the Ground, America's War in Vietnam. Well, Elizabeth, I know before we went to break, we were talking about how you finally had a resource for veterans, the suicide prevention hotline, and how you verified that that works. And it's so good to have these type of resources, not only working, but someone's there manning the calls 24/7 for our veterans that are in need.
I think it's really important. I really do. You know, now that we have a volunteer military, you know, we know that there is just tremendous stress put on those who do choose to serve. You know, these repeated tours they do, we still do not have closure on the war in Iraq, and it's been, I think, 13, 14 years. And so these deployments that go over and over and over again are very, very taxing on not only the men who serve, but on their families. So, you know, we just really have to keep the public pressure on the Veterans Administration to take care of those who are, you know, willing to defend our country. You know, whether we agree or not with the choices, you know, that's one of the great things that we learned from the Vietnam War. You know, there was a general climate of blaming the veterans, blaming the men who went to fight, because the feeling was if you didn't go fight, there could be no war. And this could get to be quite a bit of animosity. I totally understand why veterans came home and said nothing, because it was, you know, there was a lot of anger against the men, particularly who went over to fight, but also against the women. There were a number of nurses there who were taking care of the men who were wounded. So there was a lot of animosity. I personally was not among those people. I felt sorry for the people who went because I understood they didn't have a way to not serve if they didn't want to. So I wasn't among that group, but I have to say that I didn't know. In fact, you've asked me if anything surprised me. I didn't know that it was as bad as people said. For example, I did say to this one man that I interviewed, generally I'm very good at asking open-ended questions without a lot of value on them, but I did this one thing, which was I said to this wonderful man, I said, people didn't really spit on you, did they, when you came back? And he just looked at me and goes, oh, yes, they did. And he told me two exact times that it had happened, once to him and once to a guy he was walking next to. And I was like, wow. I was floored by that. So we have learned to separate the war from the warrior, and that's good. But as important as it is to say thank you for your service to a veteran, we need to also make sure they're very supported in more profound ways than a single sentence that doesn't cost us anything to say, you know, but we have to make sure that they get the services they need.
Yeah. Well, and I like how you also talk about that, you know, young people today are facing a lot of the same issues that our country was facing back in the 60s and 70s. And I'd love for you to expand upon that.
Yeah, that is something that really was kind of a serendipity, because I must have finished writing this book a little bit more than a year ago. Because of the way publishing works, you have to get the whole thing done before they begin the process, what they call in-house, through the publishing house, of getting it printed and in the warehouses and available for distribution. So in that time, what happened is we've seen some really amazing things happen because of social media. And we've had some really horrific things happen. We've had a really clear example that a lot of young African-American men are being shot by police all over the United States, disproportionate to young white men. So that is something you can't just say, oh, that happened once in a town near me. With social media, you see how repeatedly that is happening. We've seen what happens when basically our schools become shooting galleries. It's horrifying to see that over and over again. And then all of a sudden, we have a high school where the young adults say, no more. We don't want this to continue happening. And because we have social media and the word can get out and it gets out fast, we have been, over the last year, just developing amazing protest movements, just amazing. And this is where I just have this, I find this a very exciting time, and it's a dangerous time for a democracy to get so split that we have people saying and feeling one thing and saying and feeling another thing. And it's just, it is very exciting because I think some really good change can come out of this. It's not without its cost, and it's not something I expected to see again in my lifetime. I do think young people have to fuel movements like this. They don't just, it's not somebody my age with my, enthusiasm of the 60s getting back out on the streets. It's got to be young people saying, no, this is not the country we want to grow up in. And that's what's happening right now. And it's, I do find it very, very exciting. And we'll see how it goes,
Well, as someone that's, not of that generation, a little bit older here, I personally, I think a lot of people are just like, finally, it's about time. I'm so glad that we're having these discussions because it feels like we haven't been heard all this time.
Yeah. I think that's true. I think it's, and I do believe it has to be, there has to be a passionate kind of anger that comes from, it's got to be youth. It really does. I mean, we can support them, but there's some kind of idealism that I think can make it work.
Yeah, well, and there are future voters. So,
Yes.
It gives some pause for our politicians to just have a little bit of a pause, going, I might want to rethink, or listen to this, because we have a mass group of people who are, of young people who are going to be voting in the very near future.
Yes, I think that's that is truly the core of our democracy, is the vote. And I think, this happened in my own family where I asked a couple years ago, I asked one of my daughter-in-laws, I was like, oh, hey, how did you guys vote in this recent election? And she said, actually, we were too busy. We didn't get around to it. Well, now that same young woman is actually working for a candidate as a volunteer really hard to make change. And she's out there knocking on doors, getting other people to vote. And I was like, yep, this is how it happens, We've made this tremendous change, and it's wonderful.
Mm. Well, and gosh, I know you cover so much in your book. And of course, we don't have time to go through all of it. But I mean, you talk about not only Martin Luther King Jr., you talk about John Lennon, you talk about how the, President Johnson and all these different folks helped shape that time in history. And it's such a profound and I felt a very honest read on what's going on during that time. What would you like our listeners to take away, from reading your book, Boots on the Ground?
Well, I think there's several different strands I was working on. I would like a young adult to be able to see that war is not glamorous. I think there's kind of, that's another sort of aspect of youthful exuberance, is that fighting in the military is going to be something glamorous. And I hope that people will see it's much different than that. It's difficult, it's painful, it's challenging, it's rough. It's really rough. I just want young adults to know that. So that was kind of one of my starting points, and I certainly got more than I bargained for as I interviewed the men and women who served there. I also was very interested in all the different issues that came up racially. So when I interviewed people, I did a lot of kind of just looking for people that were from different geographical locations, so it wouldn't just be in my, I knew I could find veterans where I was, but I wanted to find across the country different people. And I wanted people from different racial groups because I wanted to see how that played out, because that was a big part of the 60s, was that we had a lot of civil unrest going on. And that also was really interesting to me because there was a lot of racism for the African American that I interviewed. I had 2 Asian Americans who experienced racism because they looked like the enemy. So, for example, I had one man who was actually David Oshiro. The first day he was out in the field wearing jungle fatigues, like the South Vietnamese he was with, he was shot through the neck. As he lay on the ground, the medic approached him after the fight was over, took a look at him and said, "Oh, leave that gook for later. We'll come back for him." And David was like, he pulled out his dog tags and said, I'm an American. And from that moment on, he never felt he could trust anyone because he didn't know how that would play out for him. So I liked doing that racial strand and also seeing how no matter what the racial issues were, when they were fighting, when they were side by side, they were one, because your life depended on not only doing the best job you could, but your brothers doing the best job they could. So that was a very interesting strand for me to work through. But I think also I just want people to really see that by reading about how these people I interviewed, how they put their lives together afterward, I want people to see that you're never over what happened to you, that it makes you, it's part of who you are. And as one young man said to me, Tom Kelly, he said, I would never give it, it was horrible for me, but I would never change it because it made me who I am today. And I thought that was just such a great way of saying that. Yeah. I think also pardon me?
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
I also, the other thing I really enjoyed doing was, so all these people came back, mostly men. They came back and they just, they grew their hair long. They didn't tell anybody they'd been in Vietnam, and they tried to get on with their lives in those first few years. And one man, Jan Scruggs, whom I was able to interview, he's the guy who came back. He also almost committed suicide, but one night in his kitchen, drinking heavily, kind of surrounded by flashbacks of a group of men that he knew who had died, he said to himself, who will remember their names? Who will remember these men who died fighting for our country? And when his wife woke up in the morning, he said to her, I am going to build a memorial right in the middle of Washington, D.C., and it's going to have the name of everyone who died in Vietnam on that wall or on that memorial. And then he's the one who, masterminded the whole Vietnam Veterans Memorial and had, was part of this group that accepted Maya Lin's proposal and got the memorial built within a few years, which is just unprecedented. And then they threw a giant welcome home veterans party in 1982. And that was the beginning of our being able to connect veterans and protesters and say, we are all one country. Where do we go from here?
Yeah, it's been interesting. I think sometime last year we interviewed a New York Times bestselling author who was there during when all this was going on. And the one thing he said during the interview is that he really regretted, how as he felt in the community he was with felt during that time towards veterans. And that's the one regret he had during the entire time. And I think when we look at, separating the war from the people, and looking at our veterans and the things that we asked of them to do, and then, and how we treated them when we came back, I think that was a very heartfelt way of just saying, hey, we did a lot of things right with the protest, kind of like what we were discussing here, but I think there's a lot of remorse for a lot of people on how they treated veterans when they returned.
Yeah, I think it was a real learning experience. And, we haven't had a draft since 1973. We don't have one, but we do have a standing draft board, and they do meet regularly. And, one of the things I say to young people is, this could be reinstituted quickly, like very quickly, because everyone is required at currently all young men, when they turn 18, are required to, register. They're required to register for the draft. So all that information is in place. So we could, with just Congress voting for this and the president okaying it, have a draft again. And I think that's really important for young people to know. They do go ahead and register without thinking what that means. And I think it's important. And honestly, I'm not against having a draft again, because that would everybody would be engaged again. We would have everybody would care about the military in a way that right now we don't. We as civilians are not part of the group that's actually getting sent on repeated deployments. So I keep an eye on that. I think it's interesting, and I do talk to young adults about it so that they are aware where they stand.
Yeah, how that's important. I mean, a lot of them have no idea what that means, because they weren't around during the time of Vietnam. So that's all that can be very foreign to them outside of textbooks. Right.
That's exactly right. And on a slightly different, but of course very related note, as I was working on this book, I realized, oh wait, there are no wars without refugees. Refugees are part of every war. Civilians are always caught up in a war. And I thought, I can't do this book without having a chapter about what happens to somebody, to a Vietnamese who's living in Vietnam and gets caught in this war and ends up a refugee. So I was able to interview a woman who was probably 18 when she was living in Da Nang in the middle of the country, and she was the oldest in her family of 6 or 7 children. And when the communists were in their final assault down into South Vietnam, there she was in the middle of the country. And when her family got told, run. You have to get out of here, run. Her family got separated in half in that moment, and she got her mother and 3 little siblings all the way down to Saigon at the bottom of the country, and then just running before the communist forces. I mean, it's amazing. They all made it down, all the way down to the bottom of the country. And then the day Saigon fell, she had gotten her whole family, including one was just a 2-month-old baby, onto a barge that eventually loaded them onto a large American ship, and they made their way eventually to the United States. And you just read a story like that in with all the stories of the military. It really gives a full picture of everything that goes on in that kind of chaos and destruction of a war.
I'm so glad that you have so many different views in looking at the Vietnam War. I think it's made a major impact for the people that will be reading Boots on the Ground. And I think I have time for one more question here. When in reading your book, it was interesting to hear just how Martin Luther King was so, he'd gone out of the country so he can write his book, and he was just at this point where he was looking at these magazines and really felt like he needed to do something more because he had worked so hard for civil rights, but at the same time, he had these agreements with Johnson. And I'd love for you to kind of just explain a little bit more about that for our listeners.
Yeah, that was this is, again, here we are on the question of your morals being tested, because Martin Luther King was so important in the civil rights struggle for many reasons, but one was that he had a relationship with President Johnson and could sit down and talk to him about his concerns. And President Johnson was very important in the civil rights struggle. I mean, he was doing amazing things to support the civil rights struggle. So when Dr. King's conscience was tested, he said to himself, how can I protest against violence and discrimination in the United States and yet say nothing about the war in Vietnam? It just really hit his moral fiber, because he basically had been saying to white people, if you don't help us speak out against racism, you are part of the problem. So here he is, like, going, I have to speak out. And he knew it would cost him, so he did finally have to come out very clearly against the war. And he also saw, how can we ask our young African-American men to go fight in Vietnam alongside white men, and yet when they come home, they can't live in the same neighborhood. So he did come out quite forcefully against the war, and then it cost him. It really cost him, because President Johnson took a little while to figure out what was going on before King gave his speech coming out against the war. And then once King came out and said that it was an immoral war, Johnson wanted nothing more to do with him, because once you went against Johnson, that was it.
That was it. Yeah.
That was it. He was a take no prisoner kind of guy, and that was it. So I just am, so profoundly grateful to Dr. King that he was willing to pay the costs that he did, because he had to live by his own sense of morals. And it cost him in the civil rights movement as well, because people said to him, how can you do this? You have to stay focused on the civil rights struggle and not come out against the war. That's a whole other issue. And he just, that's who he was. He had to listen to his own conscience.
Well, he's staying true to who he was, and his beliefs, which, I can understand why, you can't really ignore one atrocity and while you're making deals for, the civil rights movement to come to, but we were, equal rights for everybody.
Right. Yeah. But it's courageous. He was a very courageous person. Yeah. It's like, I think one of the things, I asked myself as I read interviewed people and read everything I could get my hands on. It's like, wow, would I have had some of the courage some of these people did? I haven't been tested that way, and I just was in awe of the strength that all of these veterans showed. The refugee I interviewed, Dr. King. I mean, there was a lot of testing of moral fiber that I was very taken with and touched by.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you can't read your book and not feel just what a tremendous time that era was, and how it's so important that we remember what had happened and what people had gone through, because it's that whole, you have to know your past so you don't repeat it.
Yeah, that is a truism, and it's painful when you see that we've fallen into some of the same struggles again. That's it's like, no, do your history lesson. Read more about this. Figure out a better way.
Yeah. Well, Elizabeth, it's been such a pleasure to spend this time with you. Where can our listeners connect with you and be part of your community, and, of course, learn more about Boots on the Ground?
There's two good ways to connect with me. One is my website, which is www.elizabeth-partridge.com. And another way is Twitter. My handle is ePartridge, which is EPARTRIDGE.
And we'll have the link here for our listeners to connect with you as well. Thank you, Elizabeth, for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth. It's been such a pleasure to spend this time with you, and of course to talk about your new book, Boots on the Ground, America's War in Vietnam. Again, if you'd like to connect with Elizabeth, you can do so at elizabeth-partridge.com, and also make sure to check out her book at Barnes & Noble and all major retailers. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Thursday, Friday, and Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.